NATO nations. They are listed top to bottom by GDP. They are listed on the right side by the percentage that they provide. Can you blow that up more? Blow it up so they... Okay, so I want to... I do not. Should. So I want to just talk you through this. Of course, U.S. is at the top with almost $29 trillion in GDP. Then you go down to Germany, UK, France, Italy, Canada, and Spain. Down here, you've got the frontline countries. You've got Lithuania, you've got Latvia, you've got Estonia. Some of the Balkan countries are down below. The ones that I want to point out, and the summit tells us that they are going to be going above 3% somewhere. Easy. So I want to point out right here, we have got the major economies in NATO, specifically France, Italy, and Canada, that are well below Italy, Canada, and Spain, that are well below their current 2% commitment. These are major economies. This is a major change that needs to happen at the summit. Next slide. Now, just a couple of comparisons. This compares Poland to everyone else on the eastern flank. The eastern flank being defined as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Poland has a GDP of about $840 billion. Eastern flank is $890, so they're not dissimilar. The defense budgets are quite a bit dissimilar. Their percentage, though, Poland is at over 4% currently and going higher. The eastern flank is at 2.36 and going higher and is already committed to go higher. Next slide. And one more, just to give you an idea of where the funding in NATO stands. This is Germany versus the eastern flank. So we've added Poland to the east of Germany. So Germany has the 4.6, eastern flank has 1.7. Here are the defense budgets. Look at this. The eastern flank is providing a higher percentage than Germany is. So my point in all of these three slides is there is work to do in the summit later this month. Now, I know that people have made commitments, but what you just saw were 2024, the last year we had a full year's funding toward NATO. That is a major problem that I wanted to highlight. We've got other issues in this briefing, but that's the one that I wanted to start with. The first thing we have to start with is everyone pulling their weight in NATO. With that, I yield back, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Kind of make a question inquiry to the chair. Those are important charts that you just presented. Could you make copies so that we could look at them here? And
let's have copies made.
Shouldn't be that difficult for the staff.
Absolutely. So we can do it now. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. We will do that. Mr. Keating.
I don't know if this is working. Hello? No, it's not working here. How's this? Oh, good. All right, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today, and I want to thank our witnesses for their participation in today's hearing. More than 75 years ago, in the wake of World War II, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established to forge a safe, secure, and prosperous transatlantic alliance. From its inception, NATO's founding charter and its Article 5 principle of collective defense have been the underpinning of our national security and that of our European partners as well. We saw this in action after 9/11, when our allies sacrificed treasure and blood in our defense. NATO's necessity came into full view in February of 2022 when the Russian Federation initiated a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Since the invasion, NATO has marshaled billions of dollars in military support to the Ukrainians who have defended the front line of freedom at great human cost. During the 2024 Washington summit, support for Ukraine within NATO was clear as allies agreed that Russia remains the most significant and direct threat to the security of the alliance. Just 1 year later, the Russian threat to NATO remains all the pressing and all the more real. At that summit, NATO allies also agreed to increase defense spending to build on the alliance deterrence. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states have well exceeded the 2% mark, while others, like the United Kingdom and Germany, have committed to and passed legislation to ensure their defense spending increases in accordance with the alliance's requirements. Meanwhile, other countries have lagged behind the 2% mark, and it's absolutely imperative that all allies commit to adequate defense spending levels at the upcoming NATO summit in Hague. Unfortunately, NATO continues to face serious threats to its security. The Trump administration's policy towards NATO has been inconsistent and chaotic. It's no wonder that the alliance is just confused about where Trump and his cabinet are on these critical issues. On the war in Ukraine, Trump's Secretary of State has said Russia started it. Meanwhile, President Trump said Ukraine started it. Trump's Secretary of the Treasury says Putin is a war criminal. Trump's chief negotiator for Russia, Steve Witkoff, said Putin is not a bad guy and that he's trustworthy. Secretary of State often said Putin was a war criminal. When I questioned him 2 weeks ago, Secretary of State wouldn't say that. At the United Nations, the Trump administration abandoned our allies on a resolution siding with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea. It's no wonder Trump's ambassador to Ukraine, Bridget Brink, resigned, citing policy disagreements. As we approach the 76th NATO summit in The Hague later this month, the Trump administration must take advantage of the opportunity and set the record straight. First, the administration must not step back from its leadership role in NATO. Reported proposals to abandon the Supreme Allied Commander for their European position or reduce the focus that's there in the force posture in Europe, because any of this will do nothing but harm the deterrent effect of our alliance. Second, the Trump administration must continue to encourage allies and partners to spend more on defense. I know this sentiment is bipartisan, and I want to thank Secretary General Rutafa, as well as former Secretary General Stoltenberg and Ambassador Smith for your work on doing this in the previous administration. Third, the Trump administration must make clear at the upcoming NATO summit that the United States and the entire alliance is prepared to increase the cost on Russia for its ongoing war of aggression in Ukraine. This must start with acknowledging the facts on the ground, something that the Secretary of State was unable to do when he testified before this committee last month. This includes telling the truth. Russia is the aggressor state. Vladimir Putin is a war criminal who's carried out atrocious crimes in Ukraine, including the kidnapping of 20,000 children. And the United States must hold the Kremlin accountable for this war and the horrific crimes Russia has committed in its wake. Anything less represents a failure of American leadership and an inability to uphold key American values. Finally, the Trump administration must build upon the prior administration's effort to expand NATO's relationship with the Indo-Pacific countries. Russia's war in Ukraine has a direct implication on the Taiwan Strait, and ensuring robust relationships with our Indo-Pacific allies is vitally important for this transatlantic relationship. I want to thank our witnesses again for being here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. I was extremely impressed with the written testimony of all three. I'd like to start and introduce Rear Admiral retired Mark Montgomery, CCTI Senior Director and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sir, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Self, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the committee, on behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for having me here to testify. Look, we're here to discuss the future of NATO, the alliance that successfully led the Western democracies through the Cold War and the U.S. triumph over the Soviet Union. And I think that while the political, security, and economic dynamics have changed markedly over the past 30 years, I firmly believe that NATO can still serve as the organizing principle that guides the transatlantic alliance through the challenges posed by a really rapacious authoritarian state, Russia, as well as the Chinese-led axis of aggressors that really supports and enables Russia. For far too long, many of our NATO allies have ignored these threats. They failed to invest in the alliance. Chairman Self's diagram showed you that. They've even failed to invest in their own defense, and warnings by successive Republican and Democratic presidents went unheeded for 30 years. However, thanks to Vladimir Putin's violent military aggression against Ukraine and his persistent efforts to undermine democratic governments in the Balkans and throughout Eastern Europe, and combined with President Trump's vocal complaints about European defense spending, we are starting to see NATO members finally stepping up to the plate. I too appreciate Secretary General Mark Rutte as he's directed NATO member. He anticipates now that NATO members will agree to increase the defense spending target to 5% of gross domestic product, GDP, at the NATO summit in June. This increased spending is essential, and President Trump has been right to call out the previous European apathy on this issue. And that reason is because Russia and Chinese threats challenge the territorial integrity, democratic stability, and economic prosperity of NATO. Neither Russia nor China will be cajoled or coddled into compliance or even peaceful coexistence. And both Europe and America need to recognize that we are in a long-term fight with the axis of aggressors. But between these two authoritarians, the chief threat to peace and democracy in Europe is Russia. And Putin is not some misunderstood regional leader or an aggrieved actor reacting to NATO expansion. He is instead a stone-cold killer. He's launched wars of conquest, invading his neighbors 3 times in the past 20 years. He has ruthlessly and violently crushed democratic movements growing in his hinterlands, and he is currently harassing, torturing, and murdering his domestic critics. If NATO is going to prevail against this Russian menace, it is going to need U.S. leadership. It is going to need European defense investments, and it's going to need collective action to punish its adversaries. My written testimony covered 10 recommendations to achieve success. I'd like to highlight 5 of them here. First is the one Chairman Self highlighted. We need to establish and maintain NATO defense spending targets at 5% of GDP. NATO's national governments, even those not within range of Russia's long-range fires, must commit to Secretary General Rutte's proposed new spending pledge of 3.5% of the GDP on defense and another 1.5% on defense enablers, like their industrial base, infrastructure protection, and cybersecurity. This includes the United States. Second, we need to act to protect the critical infrastructure essential to NATO's military mobility. Moving troops and equipment efficiently over land, sea, and air is essential to NATO's ability to project power and sustain forces to fight and win our wars. European countries must prioritize critical infrastructure spending to align with NATO's war plans, not their domestic plans, particularly as it relates to flowing U.S., UK, and French forces into and through Europe. Third, we need to maintain U.S. enablers and force posture in Europe. NATO's strength is measured by how quickly it can move and fight. That speed depends on U.S. enablers, our strategic lift, our operational logistics, our intelligence, our command and control infrastructures. These are capabilities that no other NATO ally can provide. That is why forward stationing U.S. forces and equipment across Europe is essential to NATO's warfighting capacity. The answer to this challenge from Russia is not for America to do less, but for Europe to do more. Fourth, we need to arm Ukraine to defend itself and survive, and not force Ukraine to agree to an unacceptable ceasefire negotiated under duress, or even worse, to lose the war. And Ukraine needs 2 things above all else. First, they need constant U.S. intelligence support, and second, they need access to the American-made munitions for them or for Europe to purchase. And then fifth, we have to punish Russia for its aggression. Putin will only change his calculus if the cost of continuing the war becomes unsustainable for him. The United States and Europe must increase pressure and impose costs on Russia by ramping up sanctions on the Russian war machine, starting with its energy revenues and the shadow fleet of fossil fuel deliverers that support that. In summary, I think we need a comprehensive transatlantic effort, defense budget that reflect today's challenges, the resilience to withstand assaults from adversaries, and a clear-eyed commitment to the alliance. If we have those three pillars in place, the United States and its European allies will once again prevail over the forces that threaten peace and security, both in Europe and globally. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. We had a clock malfunction just like they do in basketball games, but thank you for your testimony. I now introduce Dr. Nile Gardiner, Director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom and Bernard and Barbara Lomas Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome, sir. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
My name is Nile Gardiner. I'm the Director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom of the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own. My remarks today are a summary of my written statement. NATO remains the essential force that holds back the Russian bear on its eastern flank and keeps in check the imperialist ambitions of Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. Its role is vital in the defense of Europe in the face of Russian aggression. Without NATO, the brutal reality is that Russian forces would very likely today be rolling into the Baltic states and deep into Europe. We should not underestimate Putin's malevolent intentions and his desire to conquer further territory in Europe. To sustain the alliance, America's NATO allies must fully participate in burden sharing with the United States. The Trump presidency is rightly applying pressure on America's allies to do far more to foster true partnership rather than dependency, especially as the US must increasingly focus on the immense threat from communist China in the Indo-Pacific. This cannot be a two-tier alliance where the United States carries the overwhelming military burden for the defense of the free world, while some European allies build vast welfare states. In 2024, only 22 NATO members spent the 2% of GDP on defense agreed to by the alliance in 2014. This is hugely irresponsible. This includes some of the biggest nations in NATO, including Italy, Spain, and Canada. Last year, Canada embarrassingly spent just 1.4% of GDP on defense, a shockingly low figure for the world's 10th largest economy. As Heritage Foundation research has shown, European NATO members have collectively underfunded their own defense by $827 billion since 2014, nearly equal to the entire annual US defense budget. This is a staggering figure. As NATO leaders gather shortly in The Hague, there is, however, growing calls for optimism. President Trump's tough love strategy has made a tremendous impact. In just the first few months of his presidency, Donald Trump has already significantly strengthened the resolve of the NATO alliance. President Trump is not the destroyer of NATO, as his critics allege, but the savior of NATO. Trump's presidency is a wake-up call for a complacent alliance that had been sleepwalking to decline and possible self-destruction. Thanks to US leadership today, which was strikingly absent under Joe Biden, who is barely in command on the world stage, the complacency of past decades has been thrown out of the window. Since Donald Trump took office in January, there has been a dramatic change of approach among our 31 NATO partners, including Europe's economic powerhouse of Germany, with nearly every European NATO member announcing plans to significantly increase defense spending, enhance overall military capabilities, and grow the defense industrial base. This is the Trump effect in action across the Atlantic. But words are not enough. It is time for all of America's NATO allies to make a firm commitment to immediately match America's current spending level of 3.5% of GDP and pledge to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP. The US also cannot allow NATO to be undercut by grandiose visions of a European Union army that would split the alliance and divert vital resources away from NATO. One of the biggest threats to the future of NATO is posed by French President Emmanuel Macron's calls for greater strategic autonomy for Europe, moving away from the United States and moving closer to an accommodation with Beijing. The United States must fight the flawed notion that Europe's security rests upon delusional ideas of a militarily powerful EU, which would replace NATO nation-state cooperation with Brussels-imposed supranationalism. Macron's perilous rhetoric is exactly what Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese Premier Xi Jinping wish to hear. The US should also strongly oppose the massively reckless and incredibly dangerous decision taken by Britain's socialist government, led by Keir Starmer, to hand over direct control of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, a close Chinese ally. The islands are the home of the vital Anglo-American military base of Diego Garcia. This is a major gift to Communist China at Britain's expense and greatly undermines US strategic interests and NATO cohesion. The Chagos surrender is the worst foreign policy move by a British Prime Minister in the modern era and a betrayal of the US-UK special relationship. In conclusion, the United States has a significant national interest in supporting a strong NATO alliance. A secure Europe and a robust transatlantic alliance greatly advances the security of the American people. American exceptionalism is the most powerful force for liberty in the world today. It is greatly strengthened by America's alliances, and NATO is at the very heart of the transatlantic partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize the Honorable Julianne Smith, former U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO at the U.S. State Department. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Self, Ranking Member Keating, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity today to speak to you about NATO. For more than 75 years, NATO has been the bedrock of transatlantic security. From the Cold War to the Balkans, from counterterrorism to cyber defense, the alliance has consistently adapted to meet new challenges. Yet NATO's enduring strength lies not only in its military might, but in the shared values of its members and their collective commitment to defend one another. For these past decades, NATO has superbly served both U.S. and European interests by keeping the peace in Europe, which allowed our economies to boom. In recent years, NATO has undergone one of its most significant transformations in decades. In response to Russia's vicious invasion of Ukraine, the alliance has shown historic unity and resolve. Every single member of the alliance has offered economic, humanitarian, or military support to Ukraine, and NATO launched a new NATO-Ukraine Council to enable Ukraine to sit at the table as an equal partner. NATO also welcomed 2 new members, Finland and Sweden, and on the eastern flank, NATO established 4 new multinational battalions, bolstering the alliance's forward defense posture from the Baltic to the Black Sea. At the same time, NATO has expanded its partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. That reflects our shared recognition that security challenges like cyber attacks are increasingly global. In 2022, NATO mentioned China in its strategic concept for the very first time. And most critically, we have seen a striking rise in European defense spending. Allies are investing more in their own security. Today, 23 allies spend 2% of their GDP on defense, up from 6% just 4 years ago. That momentum is set to accelerate. Later this month, NATO leaders will gather in The Hague for their annual summit. Allies are expected to announce a new commitment to spend 3.5% of GDP on hard defense and another 1.5% on related items like infrastructure. This is very good news. For decades, Europeans have underinvested in their own security, and due to Europe's generous military support to Ukraine in recent years, the current capability gaps in Europe are acute. We should celebrate this progress, but we must also be clear-eyed about some of the associated challenges, and let me mention just 3. First, more money alone will not fix the fragmentation of Europe's defense industrial base. Without meaningful work to coordinate procurement, standardize requirements, and deepen defense industrial cooperation, this influx of funding runs the risk of simply reinforcing the inefficiencies that have long plagued European defense. Consider tanks. Unlike the US, which fields a single main battle tank, the M1, NATO's European members have more than a dozen different types of tanks. This kind of fragmentation complicates joint operations, undermines NATO's cohesion, and slows production and procurement. NATO must ensure that increased spending leads to increased capability, not just duplicated or siloed efforts. Second, spending needs a strategy, and right now, the alliance lacks a coherent approach to dealing with Russia beyond deterrence. NATO's long-term posture remains unsettled, and so do our collective objectives regarding Moscow. NATO allies created a plan to tackle such questions when they committed last year to unveil a new Russia strategy during this year's summit in The Hague. But the alliance paused work on that strategy for fear that it might not reach consensus in the current political climate. That was a mistake. Without a clearly articulated and forward-looking Russia strategy, we risk losing the political rationale for sustained investment. Finally, the alliance today is grappling with a growing trust deficit, which is quietly shaping the way that allies approach increased defense spending. Many European governments worry that U.S. support for NATO is now conditional and subject to sudden shifts. Some allies worry about the recent U.S. shift away from support for Ukraine. These new uncertainties are leading allies to hedge their bets. Instead of making bold, long-term investments in shared NATO capabilities or better co-production efforts with the United States, some allies are focusing solely on capabilities made in Europe. Unless this trust gap is addressed directly, with steady U.S. leadership, transparency, and a shared strategic vision, America's security will be undermined and the alliance as a whole will risk missing the full potential of the current momentum. In sum, NATO remains the most successful military alliance in history, and it is crucial to both U.S. and European security. But the way we manage this moment will define the next generation of transatlantic security. We must lead with vision, with principle, with humility, and we must invest wisely and anchor our efforts in strategy and solidarity. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for 3 strong testimonies. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to start with, I want to start with what I think is one of the most unstable areas of NATO, and that is in the Western Balkans. As you know, or may not know, General Cavoli told me in my recent visit with him that Bosnia and Herzegovina could collapse overnight. And you may remember back in 1999, NATO, in actually their first operation, went to war for Kosovo by bombing Serbia. We now have, and if you look at the map, you have Slovenia, you have Croatia, there's Bosnia, there's Montenegro, there's Albania, there's Bulgaria, there's Romania, surrounding 3 entities that are not part of NATO. Everyone I just named are part of NATO. You've got Bosnia-Herzegovina that's split between the Croat Muslims and the Republika Srpska. You've got Serbia and you've got Kosovo. Kosovo wants to be, the president tells me that NATO membership of Kosovo is the most important issue for Kosovo. And yet we have 4 NATO members, some of whom actually were in NATO back in 1999, that participated in protecting Kosovo from Serbia. Now we've got, I would like to start with you, Dr. Gardiner. What can we do to bring more stability to the Western Balkans, which is a flashpoint, has been historically and traditionally a flashpoint, to bring stability to the Western Balkans through admitting Kosovo to NATO? Is that a viable solution?
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Chairman. And I think the situation in the Balkans today is one of upheaval, ongoing crisis, especially with regard to Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we have a fundamental, I think, lack of national sovereignty and self-determination. You have, in effect, a sort of European elite that rules over Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we need to see, I think, the restoration of full sovereignty and self-determination. And I think that as long as you have this EU-driven elite that actually, in effect, controls the nation, you're not going to be able to move forward and end, I think, the tremendous tensions that exist within that region. With regard to Kosovo, I think great steps have been taken in terms of advances within the nation. They clearly seek to be part of the NATO alliance. I think that with regard to Kosovo, there has been a lot of positive developments. I think we'll have to assess how things move in the coming months and the next 2 years or so. But I have to say that there is growing optimism with regard to the broader outlook for Kosovo and for future participation in NATO. So I do remain optimistic on that side.
Thank you,
yes.
Admiral
Yeah.
Montgomery.
I'll take a slightly more aggressive approach and say that I think Serbia and the Republic of Srpski are both bad actors who place Balkan stability at risk. I think their leaders, Vučić and Dudic, are thugs who are intentionally, I think Dudic is trying to make the Bosnia largely a tinderbox, and Vučić has aims on eliminating Kosovar sovereignty. Our response needs to be strong. We need to support KFOR, the NATO force that's in Kosovo as a stabilizing force, make sure it's properly equipped and enabled with European and American support. But most importantly, we do need to move Kosovo along the path to further European integration through both the European Union and NATO. And the United States needs to use its significant power to push countries like Spain who oppose this into doing the right thing and allow Kosovo to enter the broader European environment.
Thank you, Ambassador. I need to make one more point. I appreciated your point about more money does not mean our industrial base is sufficient. And you pointed out the European industrial base, but our own industrial base needs reform and re-energized as well. Would you like to comment on that in my last 20 seconds?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for raising the Western Balkans. Just quickly, this is a region that demands attention from 3 different corners of the world. NATO has to remain engaged. The European Union must stay engaged to continue to pursue diplomatic efforts to work towards peace, and the U.S. needs to show up and be present and engaged. If not, Russia and China are waiting in the wings and play a very active role in that neighborhood, trying to divide the folks in the region and divide Europe from the United States.
Thank you. My time is up.
Okay.
So to honor the time, I will have that question submitted to you in writing. I now recognize Mr. Keating, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Smith, I was curious too, and I think this is worth mentioning. The U.S. commitment to Ukraine just isn't one with NATO. As we're dealing with continued nuclear threats, particularly in Iran, we know the danger of those threats. Well, decades ago, there was a commitment made to Ukraine. Can you talk about the U.S. commitment to Ukraine before and why that commitment was so important?
So there have been multiple, thank you, Ranking Member Keating. There have been multiple commitments to Ukraine over the years. First and foremost, the NATO alliance promised in 2008 that Ukraine would become a member of the alliance. But Ukraine has also gone through its own process of ridding itself of any sort of nuclear weapons program with the hope that the United States and other countries would come to its aid.
How big an arsenal was that? I mean, there was the U.S., there was Russia. Where was Ukraine back then?
It was significant,
Was it
not
the
on
third,
the scale of Russia, but this was an arsenal that would have, had it remained, served as a very effective deterrent to Russia's aggression that we
So the
saw
U.S.
unfold
commitment
in
was
February.
before even
Indeed.
this.
Well
and that
before.
commitment
Well
said
before.
that the U.S. would defend aggression against Ukraine.
Indeed.
And so here we are. And now we have NATO allies joining us. I'm curious, how many times has Article 5 been implemented by NATO?
Only once, sir, and that was, of course, after 9/11
So-
here in the United States, when
So who
European
benefited
allies
from that?
came
We all
to
benefited,
us.
but indeed, I was in Afghanistan and Iraq. I saw NATO soldiers. I saw them there defending, and many times unpopular in their own countries, the U.S. defense in that regard. I'm curious, too, if Putin is successful in Ukraine, Admiral, what would that mean for U.S. investment? You know, we're talking a lot about money here. What about the cost of Putin being successful in Ukraine? What would NATO, what would the United States, do you believe, have to deploy in Eastern Europe, and how expensive would that be?
Well, if he's successful in Ukraine, and I don't think he will be, but if he was successful in Ukraine, it would put tremendous pressure on the Baltic states and Poland. The Souvlaki Gap, the area that he would like to grab there, is very easy. So for us to counter that, it would take. We already have a brigade in Poland. It would take a division in Poland. We have battalions in the Baltic states. It would take brigades in the Baltic states. In other words, at a time when we are considering reducing our footprint in Europe, we would actually have to significantly increase at least those rotational forces.
And wouldn't you say, in your experience, deployment of troops is far more expensive than assets?
It is, yes, sir. It would be a lot more expensive than the $32 or $34 billion worth of weaponry
and we talked, too, about the need for our own country to do better in terms of procurement and dealing with our assets. But wasn't, in fact, we were in a period of modernization in our own country. I'm on armed services as well. And so we were modernizing our forces. And many of these outdated, by our perspective, assets were so useful to Ukraine. And wasn't, Ambassador Smith, wasn't the investment of U.S. dollars, most of that money stayed here? Is that true? Most of it stayed here in jobs and to modernize our own. So we benefited by this investment, not just Ukraine.
Absolutely. In many cases, Europeans have been purchasing equipment in the United States from our defense industrial base to send to Ukraine, as well as they've purchased equipment for their own use after they've donated more dated equipment to Ukraine. So these contributions have come back to the United States, and America's own commitments, the money that's been dedicated to Ukraine, has gone into building out our own capabilities as we've donated others.
And how important, from a diplomatic standpoint, is it to be consistent? You know, I listen, as many people do, to the comments of Viktor Orban in Hungary and the things he's saying. How discordant is the comments by someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary in our effort?
Well, it is disturbing to hear comments from our friends in Hungary that they have very mixed views on supporting Ukraine. They have found some smaller ways to support Ukraine, but this has been a challenge across the alliance to maintain that unity. But the key to it has been U.S. leadership. Well, and when the U.S. leads, it brings the allies together.
Would you say a savior of NATO would say you're on your own, or go it alone? Does that make sense?
No.
Donald Trump said those. I yield back.
Thank you, and I recognize the representative from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank our witnesses. Appreciate the timely hearing today.
Microphone.
Well, the button's pressed, but it works, just not well. So if the sound guy can do something about that, that'd be great. But so let me start over. So thank you for the hearing. It's timely, and I would ask unanimous consent to submit Vice President Vance's speech in Munich for the record. The administration sets the foreign policy for our country, and the administration's been very clear where the Biden administration wasn't. The Biden administration never would define the mission in Ukraine. They would never say what exactly they want to accomplish. The Trump administration's been clear in Ukraine by saying we want to help restore peace. And that is what the President and Secretary of State and every other tool in the executive branch is trying to do, is to restore peace. When you look at Vice President Vance's speech in Munich, he asked the fundamental question, what exactly are we defending? And not just territory, but ideas. And values. And I think it's noteworthy because we see people from Western Europe claiming asylum in Hungary so they don't go to jail for free speech or for participating in a political party like AfD or the now majority party in Poland or the winner of the presidential election from the Conservative Party there. So you see values that are undermining the institution. In the United States, by funding NATO, essentially becoming the de facto security force for NATO, has enabled Europe to spend their money on everything but defense. We've served as their defense, and it's been the umbrella to which they've extended their membership eastward. So we're pulling security while they're undermining the values that made us the West, the values that when I was in Berlin, walking through Checkpoint Charlie in the days after 9 November 1989, that we said we were defending. And instead, it's the other way. So, you know, Ambassador Smith, I just want to be clear because of this ongoing discussion about Ukraine. Is Ukraine a NATO member country?
It is not today.
I didn't think so. Yeah, we're certain of
It's
that.
one of NATO's closest partners.
But we seem to keep treating NATO as Ukraine as a member of NATO. Should we make Ukraine a member of NATO?
The alliance agreed in 2008 and stated that Ukraine will someday become a member. Right now, there's no consensus across the alliance to do so.
Yeah, there's clearly not a consensus, and I think for good reason, because if we brought Ukraine into NATO, we would immediately be in a state of war. One of the things that people like to refer to is Article 5. So, you know, Admiral Montgomery, you said in your testimony that, quote, the U.S. posture in Europe gives NATO's Article 5 its teeth. I worry that, you know, that kind of proves my point that it enables the European Union member countries to basically rely on America's blanket of security and underinvest in their own. And I guess at some point, is your own view that Article 5 would obligate us to fight a war of actually being immediately in a state of war if a NATO member country was attacked?
Article 5, well, if there's an Article 5 violation determined by the alliance, then I think it's highly likely the United States would participate in that war. And I do think we are the enabler. There's no doubt our GDP is equal to all of Europe, so it's likely that if we were all spending we're currently spending, I know the graph said something else, but I think we spend about 3.02%, 3.025%, to put a specific number on defense. We don't spend that. I mean, I got to be clear here. We're barely clear of the numbers we want them to get to. But if we're spending that much, and they spend that much, we will be able to secure ourselves and deter Vladimir Putin from doing things. My goal is not that we fight Article 5, but we make it clear to Putin that should you attack a treaty ally of ours, like the Baltic states or Poland, we will hold you accountable. And therefore, when he sees how strong we and Europe together, and I agree with you completely, Europe needs to carry its load, and Europe was apathetic for 30 years, but they're coming around, led by the Eastern Europeans. And even the president has acknowledged that the Eastern Europeans, who are spending 4% and now soon 5%, deserve our support. The president's spoken about the Baltics that way.
It's good, and I'm glad you acknowledge that Congress actually has the decision on whether we go to war, so Article 5 doesn't automatically trip it. You know, my time is largely expired here, but I just want to point out that, you know, President Eisenhower thought that if we were in NATO for 10 years, that we would not have succeeded in the mission in NATO. So I think it's worth questioning, as Vice President Vance did in Munich, what are we doing here?
Thank you. I now recognize the representative from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if these things work or not. All right, I'll go back to, thank you. All right, just taking a little different tack. We've seen Russia launch information attacks and European countries that are in sensitive political contexts, and we've seen it in Georgia, we've seen it in Moldova. It's also extended to NATO countries like Romania in their recent election, and all these attacks are aimed at causing confusion. They deepen political and social divisions, they destabilize societies, and the ultimate goal is weakening NATO, I believe. So, Ambassador Smith, I'll start with you. Can you tell us how NATO is working with allies, partners, and private sector actors to kind of identify, expose, and address and combat this foreign disinformation that's coming from Russia?
Thank you very much, Representative, for raising Russia's hybrid tactics. They use a variety of tools to try and divide societies from within and divide Europeans from each other and Europe from the United States. They fly into NATO airspace. They use disinformation campaigns. There have been incidents of sabotage where suddenly we've seen arson attacks of warehouses full of weapons destined for Ukraine. We've seen undersea cables cut. So this is a standard playbook on the part of the Russians. nations. NATO has increasingly turned to improving and strengthening its toolkit. We have better cybersecurity tools. We now exercise and train to test where we would hit that Article 5 threshold under some potential hybrid attack from Russia. We have better surveillance in the Nordic-Baltic space, looking for incidents where they're about to clip another undersea cable. So NATO is the place where we can work hand in glove with our European allies to get a stronger and better toolkit to deal with Russian gray zone tactics.
I'm glad to hear we're doing those things, but at the same time, we're eliminating the Global Engagement Center. Can you address how that might work to our disadvantage?
Well, that's unfortunate because right now in the U.S. government, it seems that this administration is not placing any importance on those types of efforts to combat disinformation stemming from not only Russia, but Iran, from China. These countries work together to share messages, to learn from one another in how they promote these pieces of disinformation. And the U.S. traditionally has been a leader in helping allies understand how to counter those efforts. But right now, with the elimination of the Global Engagement Center, we will likely not be the beating heart of those efforts going forward.
I agree with that.
Can I add one thing on that, ma'am? The Trump administration didn't get rid of the Global Engagement Center. Congress did. You allowed its authorities to expire last December. I agree, it's a mistake. But what the Trump administration has done is gotten rid of the Voice of America and most of the other distribution systems, which is a mistake. That tells the truth about America for people to hear. When I lived in the Soviet Union in the early 1980s, Voice of America and Radio Free Europe are what you could hear there to hear the American story. So I'm disappointed in the Trump administration for that, but I don't blame them for the Global Engagement Center. You and Congress allowed that to expire in December of last year.
I didn't. Don't say I did, but yeah, some did.
You.
Okay. Well, you have done a few things too. Let me ask you this, shifting over here to you, Admiral. Excuse me for saying General. We're fixing to go to the NATO summit in The Hague. Now, we've got two allies in a part of the world that needs more and more attention, the Eastern Mediterranean. So many things are happening in that area, from Israel, Syria, Lebanon, you name it. We got two NATO allies there. We got Greece and Turkey. Greece is a friend. Turkey is not such a reliable ally. What's the message we should be sending to Turkey when we go to The Hague next week?
Look, I agree with you, and I'm glad we're selling Greece F-35s. I think we should continue to sell Greece significant weaponry as necessary so they can do their job securing the age and southeastern Europe. Turkey needs to get a strong message from us that they should not be eligible for the F-35 until they completely give up the S-400. I'm very concerned that the administration is going to remove one little part, direct the movement of one little part from the S-400, and then say Turkey can buy F-35s. That's a mistake. Turkey needs to be held accountable for its bad decision-making on the S-400s and on its support for Hamas. And I think that's the strong message that needs to be delivered by the administration in The Hague and elsewhere.
Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize the representative, Ms. Kim.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Self and Ranking Member Keating, for holding today's hearing, and thank you for joining us today. I want to ask my first question to Mr. Montgomery. NATO's ability to deter threats from Russia depends on a robust and responsive defense industrial base. However, Europe's defense industries face critical vulnerabilities in supply chains, production capacity, and procurement strategies, as highlighted by Russia's war against Ukraine. And with some NATO allies still falling short of the 2% GDP defense spending pledge, that also limits investments in modernization and readiness. So can you talk about the specific steps that NATO allies can take to address any vulnerabilities in Europe's defense industrial base, especially when it comes to critical munitions and advanced systems production?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, and you're absolutely right. As we sourced Ukraine over the last 3 years, 95% of the what U.S. provided was U.S. equipment, but more than 50% of what of the Western equipment provided by the Europeans was U.S. equipment. They do not have an effective defense industrial base. I also don't believe they can properly conceive of what is needed. It took you, Congress, 40 years to build the current defense industrial base and trillions of dollars in direct investment. And the Europeans have not made those commitments. And when I hear President Macron talk about a European solution to this, the amount of money he discusses is way too low. So the truth is, the Europeans are going to need to rely on us over the next decade to rearm themselves, and they're also going to need to build their own defense industrial
Do you have
base.
some specific ideas as to how United States can help European allies in overcoming those shortfalls? And at the same time, we need to ensure the interoperability within our alliance.
I think we should take the the example we have right now with Rheinmetall, a German artillery firm, which is partnered with with U.S. firms so that they can scale their production properly. So what I think is joint ventures between U.S. companies and European companies that build both in the United States for jobs in the United States, but also in Europe for jobs in Europe with that European money. That is the most logical, cost-efficient way. It's not what the French are proposing, but I think long-term, that's how NATO needs to settle out.
Next, I want to talk about Russia and China. You know, in your testimony, Mr. Montgomery, you made it very clear that Russia under Putin is the, in quote, single greatest threat to peace and democracy in Europe. You also noted the role that China has played in helping sustain Russia's war in Ukraine and providing dual-use technologies and economic support. So we know China is bolstering Russia's defense industrial base with microelectronics, telecommunications equipment, and drone technology. So in that context, how should NATO adapt its deterrence and defense strategies so they can address the combined military and technological threats posed by Russia-China partnership?
No, you're exactly right. And what I'm saying there is that Ukraine is actually fighting 4 countries right now: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And I would say most of us think North Korea and Iran are the next biggest problems. They're not. It's China. China is backstopping Russia's economy. They've increased their imports and exports more than 30%. As you said, they provided the microelectronics that are going to KH-1, into cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. They're striking Ukraine every night. We absolutely have to hold China accountable for its support to Ukraine.
Is there specific capabilities or partnerships that NATO should prioritize to counter those threats?
Yeah, so I do believe NATO's role in an Asia-Pacific context will be very European in nature, very economic in nature, I'm sorry. So that what we need to do is start working together on how we sanction and export control China properly. And we need to get the Europeans more engaged in that and committed as we are.
And one more question regarding the NATO and Western Balkans. The Western Balkans is a critical region for NATO's efforts to promote stability and counter external influence. Russia has intensified its efforts to undermine NATO and EU integration in countries like Serbia, using disinformation, economic leverage, and political interference. So what specific strategies should NATO employ to counter Russia influence in the Western Baltics or Balkans, and particularly in Serbia, as I mentioned, and where the favorable perceptions of Russia are growing, especially, like I said, in Serbia?
Oh, I think you're exactly right. President Putin has supported both Vucic in Serbia and Dudic in Republic Srpski. We need to fully support Kosovo in its efforts to enter the European Union and NATO. But more importantly, we need to ensure that the stabilizing force, NATO's KFOR force in Kosovo, is properly manned and equipped to do its job, to provide the warning that's necessary so that Washington can hold Serbia accountable for threats to Kosovo.
Thank you very much. My time's up. I yield back.
I now recognize the representative from California, Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. For the purpose of my 5 minutes, I want to focus on NATO and Ukraine. But let me first remind ourselves a bit of history. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, there was strong bipartisan support that this was about good versus evil. Very clear, good versus evil. Let me quote from a speech that President Ronald Reagan gave in 1983. To ignore the facts of history and aggressive impulses of an evil empire is simply to call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. President Ronald Reagan in 1983. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, members of this subcommittee, that this is still about good versus evil, bottom line, okay? So when we look at NATO and when we look at the United States post-World War II, would you not, witnesses, share that the United States and whoever has been president of the United States, World War II to today, has been viewed as the indispensable leader of the free world? Ambassador Smith.
Absolutely, Representative. The U.S. has led the alliance since it was created 76 years ago. It has provided not only
The indispensable leader of the free world.
Yes,
Dr.
absolutely.
Gardiner, would you agree?
100%. The United States is the indispensable leader of the free world. It remains so
Real,
today.
Rear Admiral Montgomery, what would you say?
I'd say absolutely, and we should keep the command of SACEUR as part of that indispensable leadership.
So we're part of the seminal moment in world history today as we look at what has taken place, because Putin has been very clear. Although the Soviet Union has imploded, he still has visions and dreams of restoring this Russian empire. Does he not? Would all three of you agree?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, he's been very clear in all of his speeches here. So, Ambassador Smith, yes or no, do you believe a strong NATO alliance is important to counter the rising and aggressive forces of China?
Yes, I do. Not to suggest that the NATO alliance is going to operate in the Indo-Pacific, but it's deepening partnerships with Japan, South Korea.
China is very carefully watching what we're doing in Ukraine. Would all
Indeed,
three of you agree?
indeed. Yes.
Yes.
Whether or not we're going to maintain our commitment to our allies and to a democratic and free Ukraine?
Yes.
The world is watching, would you not say?
Absolutely.
So therefore, this is a seminal moment in American and world history with our NATO allies?
Yes.
Yes.
Agreed.
Admiral Montgomery, the probable outcome of the support, and you've been there, I know, recently in Ukraine, of the F-16s and other support to ensure that, and of course we're all amazed, but we shouldn't be, because once again, I remember all the intelligence briefings we received prior to Russia's invasion of over expectations and under expectations, but the Ukrainian brave people are the MacGyvers of this new type of warfare. Would you not agree, Admiral Montgomery?
I do, and their use of the F-16 has been exceptional in the few months they've been operating them.
And what should we be doing to ensure that those aircraft are fully operational and able to achieve their capability?
We gave them the F-16s, the European countries did, without what's called life cycle maintenance. The consumables, the equipment, the training, the maintenance stuff they need. We need to fully provide the life cycle maintenance, and we need to provide the right weapon systems to be used as a counter-drone.
And our allies, the Danish and the Netherlands, have provided the aircraft. We're helping to try to train the pilots, but we need to do more. Is that not correct?
That's correct. We need to do the supply chain, the logistics, and we can just sell it to them. We don't need to give it to them. We can sell it to them, but we have to provide that life cycle maintenance. And, sir, I have to emphasize, we need to give them the counter-drone rocket systems, the APKWS, that you need to fire from those systems.
You wrote a column about this last week. There are very types of systems that the aircraft are lacking that we should provide. What are they?
The rocket system I just mentioned, a active jamming system.
The jamming system is very important for the protection of these
That's right. We
aircraft,
want to
right?
make sure that the pilots who are trained in the United States and the aircraft, of which they have limited numbers right now, as you said, for the Netherlands and Denmark and eventually Norway, survive. They are fighting them exceptionally, but they could use more support from us.
Let me finally indicate, when Secretary Rubio testified before the committee here about a week ago, they talked about maximum pressure on Iran to prevent them from obtaining nuclear weapons. And by the way, I agree with that. And I urge the Secretary, what are we doing to put maximum pressure on Russia to ensure that they understand that we mean business and we're going to stay with our allies? What should we be doing?
We should be sanctioning the people who are helping the shadow fleet evade sanctions. In other words, Chinese, Indian, and Turkish companies that are taking the fossil fuels that are shipped from Russia on their shadow fleet and allow them to circumvent the existing sanctions campaigns. Neither the Biden administration nor the Trump administration has properly enforced sanctions to allow that to happen.
And if we put maximum pressure, maybe Russia will come to the realization that we mean business?
Potentially. He is Vladimir Putin, so I won't say yes.
Thank you. I've extended my time, Mr. Chairman, and I will submit further questions for the record.
And I recognize the representative from Florida, Ms. Luna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, I'm going to have to disagree with my colleague's sentiment. As Ukraine, as our ally, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Aside from that, Zelensky hasn't held actual elections since the war started, so I don't know what free and fair democracy does that. But aside from that, if we're looking at the U.S. total spending in NATO, it's 3.38% of the defense budget, which is a lot of money. My question, and I'd like to actually point out, we just saw two senators took a vlogging trip to Ukraine yesterday. It was Senator Blumenthal and Graham, or I guess it was over the weekend. But to put simply, their sanctions bill with Graham, it's basically another DC classic. The Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025 throws a 500% tariff and banking bans at Moscow, but where's the accountability for how billions in prior aid were spent? Biden's admin shoveled millions and billions of dollars into Ukraine with zero oversight, no audits, no results. Now this bill demands $55 million for monitoring, while Section 17 slaps tariffs on other countries buying Russian oil, which China will bypass through third parties. Trump's America First policies does not write blank checks. It demands verifiable wins. And if Europe is not going to step up militarily, why should U.S. taxpayers fund their security theater? Sanctions without enforced negotiations are just performative politics. You know, I was just with the House Democracy Partnership Institute. We were actually in Belgium. We met with the European Union. We met with some NATO countries. And what I can tell you is you have these countries who are not surrounding Ukraine, and they're advocating for war. But you have countries like Romania, Russia, countries like Moldova that want peace and thoroughly back President Trump's agenda. The reason that I bring that up is because I do believe if we continue funding NATO in our current capacity, we are simply making excuses, not forcing them to take a realistic approach at peace negotiations. My first question would be to Mr. Montgomery. If you could just go back and elaborate really quickly on what you had stated in regards to oil.
Yeah, right now the Russians are able to ship their fossil fuels in avoidance of the existing sanctions, which both the Biden and Trump administration have in place, by finding third parties. They ship them on illegal shadow ships, and third parties, and you mentioned them, China, India, Turkey, are receiving that. The way you normally stop that is you then sanction the companies receiving that, the ports receiving it, and the banks involved in the procurement, and then those companies back off. And historically, we've seen that happen with Iran, with North Korea, with others. So all we have to do is enforce the existing laws, the existing sanctions, and we will take away what is funding Russia's military operations.
Instead of performative politics, correct? I mean, I agree with you.
Well, instead of the, yeah.
Yes.
I think you can do that regardless of the sanction bill going on in the Senate.
Cool. And aside from that, just with that same perspective, do you think that it's a good idea for members of our Senate, members of Congress, to go outside of the policy being set forth by the White House and the Secretary of State in regards to policy with Russia and Ukraine currently?
Well, I certainly feel it's fair for senators and congressmen to go on whatever congressional delegations they want. I've supported thousands in my career, and I have no opinion on when Republicans criticize Democratic administrations or Democrat representatives criticize Republican administrations. To my military knowledge, that appears to be the normal way of doing business.
Do you think, though, that it's dangerous to have people that are advocating for policy that's pro-war when they're first and foremost not the ones on the front lines, and also to receive massive contracts from defense contractors, or not massive contracts, but massive donations and support from defense contractors? I
know Senator Graham, and I believe he honestly believes.
That wasn't directed at Senator Graham, sir. That seems to be a problem, not just in the House, but also the Senate, not specific to one member, both Democrat or Republican.
As a retired military officer, I'd never hold a politician accountable for expressing his or her views.
Sorry.
I mean, a politician should be able to express his or her views.
Oh, no, I understand that, sir. I was just asking simply yesterday. But I thank you for your time, and obviously not trying to attack you on this. I appreciate you being here today. Thank you, Chairman.
I now recognize the representative from Rhode Island, Mr. Amo.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. We know that United States leadership in NATO is essential to our own national security. We must support our European allies as they take meaningful steps to ensure and increase their own defense spending and capabilities. And we cannot pull away and isolate ourselves as the current Republican administration seeks. Maintaining a strong leadership role in NATO means standing up to the biggest threat facing our European allies, Russia's aggression. But Republicans on this very committee remain silent as Donald Trump scolds our NATO allies, parrots Putin's talking points, and retreats on the global stage. As Russian attacks are stepping up, Trump is stepping back. He's not lifting a finger to support Ukraine in their fight for freedom, sovereignty, and security. And Russian aggression towards our allies can be seen in their sabotage of essential underwater technologies and infrastructure. At least 11 undersea cables in the Baltic Sea have been damaged since October 2023, including cables disrupting essential energy and internet services to our allies in Finland and Sweden. Ambassador Smith, could you explain how NATO is countering attacks against undersea infrastructure, and how can the U.S. support this work and protect our own underwater infrastructure from this sabotage?
Thank you, Representative, for raising this particular issue. The clippings of or cutting of undersea cables is increasingly a topic of conversation across the NATO alliance, and allies have increased their surveillance, particularly in the Baltic Sea. They're sharing more intelligence, sharing best practices, and putting together a toolkit that will enable the alliance to fortify itself to these types of hybrid tactics. This is an area where U.S. leadership is indispensable, and if we continue to work through this particular issue through NATO, we'll see a stronger collective alliance response to these types of incidents.
Thank you. And, this is an example where our adversaries, especially China, are watching NATO's response to Russia's aggression. Our response, our collaboration, our refusal to retreat from this task is a signal that I think is incredibly important. And, this is, emblematic of the response that we need to have to the increased coordination and cooperation between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, as they, of course, form a significant threat against Ukraine and NATO. And so China's continued investments in critical infrastructure and telecommunication systems, in particular across Europe, raises alarms about this coordination. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about how NATO can and should counter the combined threat of coordination between those actors, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, especially with the investments from China in critical telecommunication systems.
Well, this is actually a remarkable bipartisan story, and I guess there's not as many of those these days as we would all wish. But in the Trump administration's first term, they pushed the alliance to conduct a China review that put China on the map and got allies talking about what China's doing in and around Europe. The Biden administration grabbed the baton. We were able to get China into NATO's strategic concept, deepen our partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and now handed the baton back to the second Trump administration. My hope is that this administration will continue to run down this path to heighten allies' awareness of what China is doing in Europe, whether it's economic coercion, disinformation, or fueling and helping supply Russia's war in Ukraine.
And I think it's so important there that you highlighted the fact that the sort of current context of the Trump administration and its questioning of the NATO relationship doesn't have to be. And they've already proven that through the types of collaboration and commitment that we saw prior, carrying on from administration, whether or not it's a Democratic or Republican administration. These are about values, American values that we share. The last thing I'll touch on, and I may not be able to get your answer, but I'll try to do so in writing. The point I want to make here is that it's really essential that NATO maintain a unified position against the threat of Russia and their new partners. I have questions about Turkey in this moment. And, if you could briefly, how should the United States and NATO approach member nations who are maintaining those ties with Russia that imperil the strength of the NATO relationship?
Well, Turkey is an important but complicated ally in the alliance. The U.S. needs to work with Turkey where our interests coincide, but in cases where we're at odds, we have to approach them with honesty and work through our differences, whether it's inside the alliance or in our bilateral relationship or in their relationship with Russia. I will say on Ukraine, in that first year in 2022, Turkey played an important role in trying to bring the parties together. We've recently seen renewed efforts to do so, welcoming both Ukrainians and Russians back to Turkey to hopefully negotiate.
And hopefully that's the trend line that we see continue. With that, I yield back.
And I recognize the representative from Texas, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And to our panelists, thank you all so much for being here today. I want to echo my colleagues and our witnesses' comments that NATO's very existence has averted world wars and made the United States safer. Let me be clear, it's not a waste of resources when we come together as allies to defend one another, as implied by some other members of this committee. The security and prosperity that we have enjoyed since world wars is no accident. Out of the fog of war, the United States helped found this now 80-year-old alliance that guaranteed under Article 5 that should any NATO nation come under attack, the other members will consider it as an attack against members all and will take all actions it deems necessary to assist. Article 5 has been invoked once in NATO's history, and that was on September 12, 2001, one day after al-Qaeda killed almost 3,000 people here in our homeland. In the following years, our NATO allies came to our aid, and 1,000 troops died in combat alongside Americans. But now we have a president who questions that same security assistance we relied on to keep our own nation safe. Just a few weeks ago, he said in the Oval Office, "You know the biggest problem I have with NATO? If the United States was in trouble and we called them, do you think they're going to come and protect us? They're supposed to. I'm not so sure." I find these comments incredibly reckless and irresponsible and dangerous to our national security in light of the one time when NATO's been activated, it was in our defense. Ambassador Smith, how does this suggestion that NATO allies will not defend each other impact our adversaries' perception of credible deterrence, and does this undermine our own security?
Well, thank you, Representative. When the war in Ukraine started, I think both President Xi in China and President Putin in Russia made an assumption, and that was that the NATO allies would grow weary, that they'd grow impatient, that they'd grow distracted, and they wouldn't be able to maintain focus on Ukraine. But we have maintained focus on Ukraine. We remain united. I'm worried that won't continue to be the case. I want to see continued U.S. leadership, which is critical to alliance unity. And while the Europeans are increasing their defense budgets, it makes perfect sense to remain committed to this alliance. It serves our interests in addition to the interests of our allies. So I firmly believe that the U.S. should maintain its commitment to this alliance, and that doing so will send a very strong signal, not just to Moscow, but to China, Iran, North Korea, and other countries around the world.
And it seems to me like the administration is sort of doing the hokey pokey. We're in one day, we're out one day, we're in one day, and we're turning it all about. And that is not the way to have sustained, reliable, persuasive foreign policy, in my opinion. Do you agree?
Yes, Representative, I will tell you that the day that the Trump administration suddenly, without consultation with any of our allies, flipped off and turned off intelligence sharing to Ukraine and all military assistance, it was eventually turned back on. But that day sent a chill through our European allies, our friends in Canada, who were worried that this now signals a new era where at any moment the U.S. can have a sudden shift without any close coordination or cooperation with them.
The president just sent over a rescission bill that will remove funding, critical funding for the UN. I'm curious as to how this panel feels about the U.S. decreasing its financial commitment to the UN and what that would do to our national security interests. Yes.
Thank you very much for the question. And now I fully support efforts to reduce funding for the United Nations, because the United Nations is riddled with corruption and inefficiency and frequently acts against U.S. national interests. And I think that the Trump presidency is pushing for greater accountability from the United Nations, and that is absolutely right.
Admiral, how do you feel about that?
So I'm uncomfortable with the decision, Bill, with the UN, but more so with the reduction in USAID funding for, particularly I study the cyber capability and capacity building that we've been doing in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans. And I think the cutting of that funding, the reduction in that funding will make it will make it much more difficult for U.S. forces to operate, to move in and through these countries as we like to do with our forces. So we have to be very careful with these reductions in our overseas assistance. If they have a legitimate national security value, they should be maintained. And when you eliminate 100% of everything, I tend to think you really didn't do a legitimate review.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you all so much for your testimony. I'm out of time, and I yield back.
With that, I recognize the representative from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to join this hearing, and to our witnesses. I appreciate your insights. You all use similar imagery. You talk about NATO as the beating heart, the bedrock, the bulwark. That was very consistent. Ambassador Smith, but you also spoke about a trust deficit. And I'll paraphrase, but many governments are worried that the U.S. commitment to NATO is conditional or transactional. Are European allies right to worry about the U.S., Ambassador Smith?
Well, I will tell you, having just got back from Spain a couple of days ago and having the opportunity to meet with a number of allies across Europe, there is a real concern that the United States right now is unpredictable, and that its position both on Ukraine and on the NATO alliance is entirely unclear. They do not like that unpredictability and worry about whether or not U.S. leadership will continue.
That's my time back, because I want to cover a lot of things. But Dr. Gardiner, right to worry?
If I could respond to that, actually, and I've met with dozens and dozens of European delegations here at Washington over the past few months, and also have been to several European capitals recently. And the message from our European friends is that President Trump is actually applying the right kind of pressure on our NATO partners to increase defense spending, to do more. He is really shaking up the transatlantic alliance in a very positive way, and I've not heard the negativity that you're referring to.
I appreciate that. Rear Admiral Montgomery?
I don't think this has been a wise maneuver, just like I didn't think it was wise to pull out of Afghanistan without informing our NATO allies. I think we have about a 5-year streak right now of being too unpredictable and too unfocused on the actual rapacious authoritarians staring us in the face.
And if I can pick up from there, I remember the images from Bucha. The bodies in the street, the hands tied behind backs, the faces of ordinary people, men, women, and children massacred in cold blood by Russian troops. Russia's goal was not just to seize territory, it was to extinguish a nation, to remind those still under its power that resistance is fatal, and to warn those who escaped that their safety was not assured. There was no ambiguity. It was terror, it was annihilation, and it was specifically staged for the world to see. And the world responded. NATO reinforced its eastern flank. Our allies rose to the moment, and for the time, I would argue, so did we. But I think at this moment, the United States is drifting. Not drifting, we're actually being led away from principle towards paralysis. The president has remained silent as Russia renews its campaign of drone strikes against civilians. He has not condemned the atrocities. He has not mobilized support. He has not led. And many in Congress, including some of my colleagues on the other side today, have followed that example. They speak of Ukraine's cause but shrink from its defense. They blockade, delay action, and offer platitudes in place of policy. Some have mistaken political convenience for principle, or they have lost both. We are once again at a point of strategic and moral clarity. Ukraine is not asking for our troops, it is asking for our resolve. NATO is not demanding escalation, it's asking for consistency. Each day that the United States hesitates, NATO's deterrence is tested. And not only in Kyiv, but in Warsaw, Tallinn, and beyond. And if Ukraine chooses to pursue NATO membership, as we promised in 2008, as As Ukraine is part of an agreement to relinquish its nuclear weapons, is part of the family of nations, there has to be a clear and credible path forward for Ukraine, who has made sacrifice, who has bravely fought the Russians. We need to honor our commitments and admit that door to NATO remains open to free nations, not just Ukraine, but free nations who meet its obligations and share its values. So my question, I'll turn to Ambassador Smith again. Bucha was a moment of clarity. The president has been silent on Bucha. Been silent on the renewed campaign, Russia's renewed campaign of drone strikes against civilians. He told Zelensky that he had no cards to play in the Oval Office. I can only imagine what Zelensky was thinking, knowing that there were plenty of cards left to play, as we saw this weekend. What does the president's silence communicate to our NATO allies and to Moscow in particular?
It has led to uncertainty about whether or not the U.S. is clear-eyed here about who is the aggressor and who is the victim. The U.S. needs to state repeatedly that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the victim. We must apply more pressure on Russia to move towards peace, but we also have to ensure that Ukrainians don't have any limits on the size of their forces or whether or not they can build a future force so that this doesn't happen again.
Thank you. I'm over time. As been noted here, NATO came to the United States aid under Article 5 after we were attacked on September 11th. NATO has led the way in ensuring that Ukraine is able to defend itself against aggression from Russia. There is no dispute. There should be no question. We have to be clear that that was the case. I appreciate the witness's testimony, and I yield back.
I now recognize the representative from Delaware, Mr. McBride.
Chairman, I request 30 seconds to make a unanimous statement.
You're recognized, Mr. Keating.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last hearing, you referred to Representative McBride as representative, and I can't fathom how you just can't continue to do that. In any case, it's obvious to me that Representative McBride wants to focus on the job she was elected to do. So going forward, every time you do this, she'll demonstrate who she is, and you'll demonstrate who you are. With that, let us focus back on the hearing.
Thank you, Ranking Member Keating. I am indeed here to talk about strengthening our national security by bolstering our NATO alliance, because democracy is under attack, both in the U.S. and around the world. NATO, grounded in shared cultural values with our transatlantic allies, plays a vital role in defending democracy and sustaining the U.S.-led democratic world order that protects our freedoms every single day. NATO has been a defender of democracy both at home and in Europe for over 75 years, fostering both one of the longest periods of peace between great powers in human history and the greatest expansion of freedom and individual liberty ever. On the global stage, this administration is attacking our NATO allies, Denmark and Canada, canceling foreign aid without notice, and defending Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. Most dangerously, this administration is undermining Article 5 in explicit ways. But the threat to NATO and to the security it has fostered is even more insidious than just that. Here at home, we are seeing a democratic backsliding and dangerous illiberalism take hold. When due process is infringed upon and the First Amendment is trampled upon, we are not simply violating domestic norms and constitutional freedoms. We're communicating to Vladimir Putin that we no longer cherish the shared values that underpin our commitment to NATO. We communicate we aren't willing to defend democracy here at home, and in so doing, that we're not willing to defend it overseas. That democracy and individual liberty are not principles that we will fight for. And this is part and parcel of a broader global project aimed at dismantling democratic institutions and shifting toward authoritarianism. NATO is and has been a crucial alliance for our shared national security goals and our shared values. And I intend to work with this committee, with serious members on this committee, to ensure that we remain a leader and supporter of NATO's mission. So my question for you, Ambassador Smith, as someone who's represented the U.S. in Europe, I'm curious what long-term strategic consequences could arise if the perception takes hold globally that the United States is retreating from our democratic values, and how could that impact NATO's unity, its mission, and its effectiveness?
Well, thank you very much, Representative, for that question. Look, the NATO alliance is rooted fundamentally in our shared values, and our shared values starts and ends with a commitment to democracy, to the rule of law, to human rights, etc. And so if we have a situation where certain allies are starting to question America's fundamental commitment to those democratic values, the foundation of the alliance simply won't hold. So the United States needs to not only continue to ensure that it leads this alliance as it has done for now 76 years, but it has to be the beacon on those democratic values. Without it, the NATO project, again, simply doesn't work. And it would be ultimately a win for China, for Russia, for Iran, for North Korea, and others to see the collapse of those shared values. So the U.S. has a key role in maintaining them.
So I want to build off of that point, Ambassador, specifically around the message it sends to China and Russia. I touched on in my opening comments how a receding of democratic norms and values and rights here in the United States could communicate to Vladimir Putin that we are less committed to the values that underpin NATO. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how that illiberalism here, how that democratic backsliding here could potentially embolden Vladimir Putin.
Well, we can't do anything, Representative, to signal to Moscow that we are backsliding on any of those core values. And we have to ensure that America's commitment to the alliance is ironclad. It is there. NATO is there to defend our shared values. We do not want to give Russia any impression that we're backing away from that commitment.
And then finally, in terms of NATO's unity, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, Ambassador, about the public attacks by U.S. leaders on longstanding NATO allies and how that's impacting or potentially could impact cohesion and mutual trust within NATO.
Well, look, we have been in this alliance for 76 years, and we argue all the time. I'm here to tell you, as the U.S. ambassador, I spent each and every week having debates, fierce debates, sometimes shouting debates with our closest allies. That's the way it goes in the alliance. It's like a family. Everyone feels comfortable arguing. But what you don't want to do is let those fierce debates internally boil over and give leaders around the world, autocrats, the feeling that NATO unity is cracking. You have to take those arguments head on, but work towards unity. And what I want to see is this administration reassuming and taking on that leadership role in the alliance, calling out Russia for its aggression and indiscriminate attacks on civilians inside Ukraine, and putting maximum pressure, not just on Iran, but maximum pressure on the Russians.
Thank you. I'm over time. I yield back.
The ranking member has agreed that we will have a second round. So I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I'd start out. I've got a potpourri of questions here. But Dr. Gardiner, you responded to that last, and I thought you wanted to give a response to one of those last questions. If you'll take a few seconds.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to respond to the remarks made by Representative McBride, because I think the comments there were absolutely ridiculous, and the attack on the United States as a nation supposedly backsliding on democracy bears no relation whatsoever to reality. I'm proud to live in the freest nation on earth, and the United States fights every day for freedom and democracy across the world. And I find it absolutely astonishing that a member of Congress would compare the United States to Putin's Russia. And the United States is today the beacon of democracy and freedom in the world. And we see that on a daily basis. And I just want to mention on the record that I find it absolutely appalling that a member of Congress makes astonishing attacks on the United States full of lies that carries no relation whatsoever to reality. American leadership is incredibly powerful on the world stage right now. And the United States is leading the NATO alliance based upon the principles of freedom and democracy and individual liberty. And we're seeing that. and we should be proud of that record, instead of trying to tear America down as the left does all the time. We should be proud of everything this great nation stands for, and that includes at its very heart the freedom and liberty that are the foundations of this great nation. Thank you.
Thank you. And to get back to some of the details, I'd like your opinion, Dr. Gardiner, of the arrest warrant for Dodik and the potential impact on the Western Balkans and their refusal to carry through with that arrest warrant.
Yeah, actually, on that particular issue, I'm going to defer to my colleague, Ms. Montgomery, who I think has a more detailed understanding of that particular issue. Thank you.
I do think it's a, thank you, Niles. I'll tell you, I'm not optimistic that the arrest warrant will be executed. I am confident that Dodik is a criminal and should be held accountable. And I'm afraid, I think I share your kind of implied concern in previous questions, that the Balkans are a tinderbox, and that our inability to hold Vučić and Dodik accountable is eventually going to lead to an inflammation and a deeper requirement for European and potentially even United States to get involved. So I wish it would be executed properly. I suspect it won't, sir.
Okay, very good. Now, we had a very short conversation about the Suwalki Gap. That is, in my mind, the second most important issue facing NATO. So would you give us a tutorial on the Suwalki Gap and the Kaliningrad enclave and what that enclave represents to Russia?
Well, as a retired Army officer, I'm not surprised you bring that up, but I agree with you completely. The Suwalki Gap is a narrow throat that Russia would like to grab in order to bring itself with a greater Russia, with Belarus, in contact with the Kaliningrad Oblast, which is the most heavily fortified geographic position in the world. Despite the war in Ukraine, the Russians have not backed off one iota from packing weapon systems into there that hold Poland and the Baltic states at risk. The ability to close that, I think, 60-kilometer gap would be very rapid in war. But, I believe the Russians can do that, and certainly with what they've learned in Ukraine, they will be able to do that. So I share your concern about the Suwalki Gap. This is one of those issues where Europe and NATO need to be thinking very hard about how you persistently deter Russia from being able to do that. I do not think you can get the weapon systems there 5, 6, 7 days after the fact. It will be lost by then. And the Baltic states and Poland share your concern.
And my last point in my last 30 seconds is FMS reform. We have a great need to reform FMS, and I'll just make that point on the record. We have still billions of dollars behind in weapon systems that Taiwan has already paid for. Saudi Arabia stands in front of Taiwan for the Harpoon missiles, having paid for the restart. So it's something we cannot take our eye off the ball. Ambassador, you mentioned the defense industrial base. FMS reform, I think, is vital for the future of everything that we've been talking about. With that, I yield my time, and I recognize Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot of misinformation, I believe, that's going around the U.S. And around the world regarding the commitment of our NATO allies, our European allies, in fact, the 50-country allies that all are working as one to defeat Russian aggression in Ukraine. So I'd like, Ambassador Smith, could you take some time and straighten the record out here? I mean, the contribution from Europe is extraordinary. So if you could take some time and correct some of those misconceptions.
Yes, thank you very much. There are some folks out there that believe that the U.S. has been supporting Ukraine over these last 3.5 years largely in isolation, and that's simply not the case. Our European allies have given an enormous amount of support to Ukraine. They've housed millions of refugees. They've provided critical economic and humanitarian support, but they have sent weapons. Some countries have sent them everything they had. The Baltics, the Poles, a country like Romania that sent essentially all of its air defense. These contributions have been critical to what Ukraine has been able to do to defend its territory against Russian aggression. So I completely appreciate your point. I think it's important for folks to understand that this has been an effort not just with our European allies, but with 50 countries around the world. Secretary Austin, when he was Secretary of Defense, regularly convened 50 countries from around the world, including friends in the Indo-Pacific, to each month send more critical support to our friends in Ukraine. One of those meetings is happening today, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense will not be attending the UDCG, the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. That is a shame in my mind. It's a group that requires U.S. leadership at the highest levels, and the United States started this group, and it needs to continue to lead it.
Yeah, the contact group is essential. And in fact, it's a way the U.S. is leveraging, their assets around the world, too. And so I think it's critical in that regard. I also wanted to just touch base. The Russian elections that occurred where they voted to have legitimate control over areas of Ukraine in violation of every international law that you could think of. How would you categorize those elections?
Well, it's a pretty short answer, Representative. It was a sham, and we cannot allow this to stand. In my mind, we cannot allow Russia to come in and make these assumptions and claims that the Zelensky administration is somehow a Nazi regime, that this territory that they're currently occupying belongs to Russia, that they have a right to own Crimea. None of this adheres to Ukraine's very clear territorial integrity and sovereignty, and we have to continue to stand up and push back against those types of Russian assertions.
Speaking of elections, in World War II, with martial law declared in UK, they did not have elections, did they not?
Correct.
And is someone familiar with the Ukraine Constitution?
Right. Right
there's
now,
martial
under
law.
martial law, they are not holding. Yes.
Martial law was called because of the Russian aggression.
Because of the war. Correct.
But their constitution would not allow that, even if they wanted to have that. Is that correct?
Indeed.
Admiral Montgomery, I don't think we spent enough time talking about Putin and who he really is. You mentioned that in some of your remarks, and we were looking at this negotiation that's going on, which is, negotiation is always a good thing. Talking is always a good thing. But how would you categorize Putin's response to these negotiations?
The offer in Istanbul last week was an insult to President Trump. I mean, President Trump has told President Putin several times, come to the table with a serious deal. And he's told him, stop doing Vladimir, stop doing the bombing. I thought there was a potential this time there would be a reasonable response. But instead, it was just a laundry list of every illegitimate Russian claim to Ukraine and every ridiculous request that they basically neuter themselves, demilitarize, and take no Western support. It was an absolute insult to President Trump, who has given President Putin more than enough time to come to the right answer.
Great. My time has expired. I yield back.
And now recognize the representative from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
The Trump administration was not the one that eliminated the Global Engagement Center, but rather you pointing in this direction. I said it wasn't me, but you meant Congress simply allowed it to expire. Now, the White House Republicans did indeed refuse to include the extension of the sunset in the FY National Defense Authorization Act, and based on some since debunked conspiracy theories. But the Biden administration tried to keep their work going by putting its mandate in the State Department's Counter Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Office, the RFIMI. Now, unfortunately, then, on April the 16th, Secretary Rubio announced the closure of that office as a way to, and I quote, champion free speech. Now, since you asserted that Congress failed in its decision to not reauthorize the GEC, do you also believe that the Trump administration failed in its decision to close the RFIMI?
So, and I know your staff will go do more research, and you'll read that I've written 3 articles condemning the closure of the Global Engagement Center
But I wanna hear it on the
and
record.
President Trump's closure of this. I absolutely believe we need to counter disinformation. The closure of the Department of Justice, Department of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and Department of Homeland Security's disinformation shops was equally reckless by this administration. So I absolutely think that we should be looking for disinformation. Russia and China are aggressively conducting cyber-enabled economic warfare and influence operations campaigns against this country. The one final thing I'll say is the most deleterious, worst information operations campaign going on in this country is the use of TikTok. TikTok, you and Congress properly banned it last year. President Biden signed it into law. TikTok is being used by China to change the social narrative in our country, to convince the 180 million 18 to 35-year-olds who use it that the United States is not a great country, that China's suppression of Uyghurs is okay, that China's suppression of Taiwan is okay, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is okay, and that Hamas's terrorist act against Israel was okay. TikTok needs to be banned. To me, that's the worst disinformation operation, but I agree with you completely that we need a global, something like the Global Engagement Center. I've argued for it for about 2.5 years now. I was just pointing out that the actual problem was Congress failing to reauthorize it.
Thank you. I just wanted the record to clearly show who all was responsible and what the whole context and the story was. And if you weren't answering it the way I had hoped you would, I'd take offense that you think my staff has to do my research, but you can write your own books. But thank you for that answer.
I now recognize the representative from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Chairman Self. And before I do ask my question, Dr. Gardiner, I have to tell you I take great offense. You're respectful people, honorable people can disagree on policy. To question Democrats' commitment and patriotism is unacceptable. I love my country, and I know my colleagues do. I am committed to the country, like Rear Adm Montgomery, Ambassador Smith, our colleagues here. We take an oath to defend the Constitution, and we do that with seriousness and integrity. So I take great offense. We live in a great country. We are a beacon to the world. I am the father of a Navy veteran. Like Admiral Montgomery, he was a surface warfare officer, and we can disagree. We don't need to besmirch each other's commitment to our country. Rear Admiral Montgomery, in your opening remarks, you stated, I'm going to quote you here, "I firmly believe that NATO can serve as a bulwark that brings transatlantic alliance through the challenges posed by a rapacious authoritarian state, Russia, and the China-led axis of aggressors that supports and enables Russia." And I think we agree on that. My question for you is it can or is it must? Must NATO be at that forefront?
Yeah, in my written I said can, and in my oral I said must, because I believe it's must. I mean, look, there is no substitute for us. I agree with Nile and his characterization of French President Macron's initiatives here. They're going to go nowhere. It needs to be us. It needs to be NATO. Myself, Chairman Self, others have served with NATO over 40, 50 years. We are the bulwark of democracy in Europe, and we are the only thing that is strong enough to defeat them together. Europe has to spend more. We have to spend more. We're going to go below 3% in real GDP, defense spending and GDP, not the numbers that we get from some disarmament agency in Scandinavia. We're going to go below 3%. Over the next 2 to 3 years. We need to get ours up. They need to get theirs up. It's the only way we can defend ourselves.
And I think it was Ambassador Smith, you talked about it. We need to do that in a coordinated way. We need to have a strategy, and a strategy follows a vision of the role of NATO, what role it plays today, but also into the future. What do you see as the role for NATO looking to the future?
Well, I would like to see I would like to see the alliance complete that strategy on Russia. I think existing in a world where the allies can't agree on a Russia strategy doesn't bode well for the future and this huge surge in spending. But from a more technical perspective, I think NATO can help drive co-production. We've heard a couple of great examples today. I often point to the case of Spain, Romania, Germany, and the Netherlands coming together with Raytheon to build the GEM-T missiles for the Patriots. Those types of co-production efforts are the way of the future, and NATO can help that happen, but not if the alliance is hemorrhaging trust and Europeans feel like they want to back away from us. So the U.S. has to recommit. This summit is going to be very important in terms of the signals the Trump administration is going to send, and it should, in my mind, allow the alliance to move forward both with the Russia strategy and allow it to push forward on those joint ventures that I just mentioned.
I couldn't agree more. You answered actually my follow-up question, which is that U.S. role. What is the impact of messages coming from the administration, the going one way on Monday and a different way on Tuesday and a complete reversal on Wednesday? What's the impact of getting to the strategy and the vision we need to achieve?
And let me give you just one example of where we are with public attitudes in Europe. In Denmark, they have created this app on your phone so that you can go through the store and find U.S. products so that you can avoid them. That's where we are right now.
I attended
in Denmark.
I attended a wedding in Canada last weekend, weekend before last.
It's not good. It's not good.
We went in to buy a bottle of wine. There is no American alcohol in the liquor stores, and we're seeing that. Rear Adm Montgomery, I want to give you the last word here. What is the impact of the inconsistency from the U.S. if we're going to achieve the strategy you talk about, if NATO must lead the way?
Look, as a military planner, I ran our plans in U.S. European Command and our operations in U.S. Pacific Command during my career. And the one thing that any military planner or operator wants is consistency. We need to have consistent, stable resources, operational plans, and direction from senior leadership. In the end, the president makes the direction, and we need to flex to it. But consistency is always a preferred condition.
Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony, the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. I will ask you to respond to those in writing. I will certainly have one. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.